welcome to No Favour for Pioneers, the Edinburgh Medical Heritage Podcast. Today I am talking to Daisy Cunynghame, archivist for the Royal College of Physicians, Edinburgh. Welcome.
Very nice to be here, thank you.
What is it that you wanted to chat about today?
Well, my personal enthusiasm is the history of public health in Edinburgh and in Scotland more generally. But I'm also quite enthusiastic about just the College of Physicians of Edinburgh's archives, obviously, because I work there and that's my job. So I'm very interested in talking about the history of dispensaries and the history of infirmaries. But I may stray into my other areas of enthusiasm of medical history as well.
So what is a dispensary?
A dispensary is essentially an outpatient clinic. Very occasionally they would have a couple of beds for surgical cases to recover, but generally that's the big difference between an infirmary and a dispensary. Is that infirmary has inpatient beds, dispensary is outpatient. And they really kind of came to fruition in kind of the 1770s onwards, and then through most of the 19th century and into the early 20th century. They died out and were taken over really during the foundation of the NHS. Those that were still surviving were kind of encompassed within the NHS in the 1940s. But there were a few reasons why they came about. One of which was there was this very growing idea in society of the deserving and undeserving poor, which was quite a sort of stigmatizing notion. It really kind of came to fruition. Anyone who's familiar with Charles Dickens's novels in the 19th century will probably be familiar with the idea of there's good poor people and there's bad poor people in this kind of stereotype. You know, there's the people who choose to be unemployed and the people who are drunkards and things like that is the idea. And then there are the deserving poor, which are the particularly sort of orphan children and those sorts of people. And so there's this growing idea that you need to differentiate. Dispensaries become very popular because there's this idea that because they're outpatient clinics, they don't encourage idleness. Whereas there's a kind of notion that if you get a bed in an infirmary, maybe you just want somewhere where you can get free food and you can get a free bed. And so this is the kind of growing stereotype. And I think this is why a lot of individuals, particularly wealthy individuals, wanted to put money into dispensaries. I don't think that's why physicians set them up. I think physicians were really trying to do medicine and to treat people. But I think a lot of the funding that came in, mostly through wealthy patrons, was this idea that somehow these were the better type of poor people that went to dispensaries.
So in a sense, it was potentially a precursor to the NHS, this idea of healthcare at the point of access.
I think so, and I think that the nice thing about dispensaries was they tended to have a lot less rules during this period than infirmaries. Infirmaries would have a lot of regulations, so they often wouldn't take unmarried mothers. They wouldn't take people with venereal diseases. Often they charge money. Even the charitable infirmaries, like the Royal Infirmary of Edinburgh, you might have to make a deposit, essentially in case you died during care. But there were a lot of rules around the sort of people who could get in. Dispensaries, really, they didn't worry about that. It was for anyone. I completely agree. It is kind of the precursor to the National Health Service and that whole movement. It's also very good in a slightly selfish way. It's very good for physicians because it gives them a lot of freedom they can trial new treatments, they can meet a whole range of patients. Quite often it would be a good stepping stone in your career as a physician, to get a job in a dispensary, and then that led on to other things. So it was particularly good for the less well-connected physicians because it's quite common in the 18th century particularly. There's a huge amount of nepotism. Pretty much every professor of medicine at Edinburgh University was the son of or the nephew of a previous professor. There's a lot of that sort of hierarchy to it. It's very difficult for Scottish practitioners to practice in England. There's a lot of, particularly in London. And so again, dispensaries are a way for people who aren't well connected, who don't have, a lot of money behind them to set up. If you think of the sort of money it would take to set up an infirmary, you'd have a physical building which could take a lot of money and staffing, whereas dispensaries sometimes, like in the case of Andrew Duncan, he didn't even have a building when he set up his dispensary. His dispensary was it was almost like a concept. He just said, I will treat people for free, come to me. And then once things start working, he starts expanding and it becomes something much more grand. But for someone like Andrew Duncan, who wasn't from a lineage of physicians, it was a way to get in and to get work.
So Andrew Duncan was someone who set up a dispensary. Was this in Edinburgh?
This was in Edinburgh. The site is no longer there. The street that it was on is gone because of the developments with George IV Bridge and the refurbishments that took place in Edinburgh. But it was here in Edinburgh. It was close to Surgeons Hall, where a lot of obviously the action between the university and Surgeons Hall was kind of taking place. It wasn't actually in the Surgeons Hall quad because he was forbidden. He did used to lecture there, but he was forbidden from taking in patients there. There was an idea that it would almost lower the tone to have these kind of poor, impoverished people coming into this area. This was the first dispensary in Scotland. There were a couple earlier in London, and it was the start of a really blossoming period of dispensaries being set up in Dundee and Kelso and various other places. The thing that made Andrew Duncan's dispensary really distinctive was that this was the only dispensary in this period that was also used for teaching. So as well as treating patients, he was also taking in medical students from the university and actually using patient case studies and them getting involved in treating the patient. And this is where I get particularly excited, and he left a wealth of case notes relating to his patients. And there's no equivalent records for any other dispensary because they just weren't analyzing patients in that much detail. So we know, they're not just names or numbers. We know were they married, what their job was, had they emigrated from Ireland, how many children they had. So we know a lot about these patients. They're not sort of faceless. And that's something that I personally am really excited by, is bringing the patient into studying the history of medicine. Not that I have anything against physicians, I want to make that very clear, but I think it's really nice to be able to get a picture of the people who were actually experiencing this treatment and what their lives were like.
Why was this dispensary set up by Duncan, and why was there such an emphasis on education?
Andrew Duncan comes out of this in some ways well, in some ways not so well, because there's an element where it really is ego. Essentially, the previous professor of medicine at Edinburgh University retired. Andrew Duncan was temporarily given that position, just as sort of an interim until they made the decision. He thought he was going to get the job. He didn't. It was the son of the previous incumbent. This is exactly what I was saying about nepotism. And the son was only 23 years old. So he was very young and inexperienced. Andrew Duncan was older and more experienced. And so the reason he set up the dispensary essentially was because he lost that job. And he was trying to establish himself. And he's very open about the fact that he feels that his lack of connections, his lack of a lineage is holding him back. So it's partially about, philanthropically wanting to help people, but it is also one eye on his career, essentially. At this point, the only physicians who are allowed to teach at the infirmary are professors at the university. So the University of Edinburgh and the Infirmary of Edinburgh are very interconnected. There is a special teaching ward at the infirmary, which professors at the university can use. They can bring in their students, show them certain cases, meet the patients. But the moment you lose your professorship, you lose that access. So essentially what he's trying to do is continue his research, continue treating patients, and he has to basically do it by himself because the establishment has kind of rejected him, essentially.
That's a similar piece of extramural teaching to someone like John Knox, for example.
It is. There's already, before Andrew Duncan, there's obviously this very established model, which has been going back for quite some time, of extramural teaching where, as you say, a lot of students at the university would take these extra classes, or sometimes people would come up to Edinburgh just to study the extramural classes without ever going to the university. It's very common in this period for medical practitioners to not necessarily complete their MD. They would often do a semester, a couple of classes. You could still be viewed as a reputable practitioner without having the kind of full process. The difference was the shift in Andrew Duncan's time is to include physicianly medicine, essentially. Almost all of the previous teaching had been surgery, it had been anatomy. It had been those kind of the picture you probably have in your head of these grand anatomy lecture theatres, someone in the middle with a patient examining, or if they're dead, dissecting. But actually the physicianly side of medicine really wasn't pronounced with an extramural medicine. It was very surgical. And so the idea of it being not just to do with the physical anatomy, but the diagnosis, the listening to patients and talking to patients. That was more the innovation that kind of came later, of getting students to sit in on a consultation rather than on a physical surgical process. So it is kind of a shift that brings the physicianly side of medicine more to the fore.
And did Andrew Duncan's extramural teaching then impact the teaching of the main institution?
It's difficult to say. I mean, he got his job. You know, he did
Right.
eventually get brought back in. He became a professor at the university. He regained access to the infirmary. So obviously he was viewed as a success and worthy of that position. So in that sense, he did. One of the downsides to Andrew Duncan, and this is not uncommon in this period, is that, in my opinion, he kept going too long. He had a fantastic period where he did amazing things, and he kept teaching for about 30 years after that. And so the later descriptions, and I think there's one, I can't remember the exact quote, but there's one from Charles Darwin who said, you know, he is the most boring, tedious old man imaginable, who just talks about his glory days, essentially. And I think that hasn't helped Duncan's reputation now, is that a lot of the opinions that are kind of written are from those later people who saw him, you know, when he was still teaching in his 70s. Maybe he wasn't quite at the prime of his life, but he was hugely influential. One of the major innovations that Andrew Duncan pushed forward was the establishment of a position at the University of Edinburgh of medical jurisprudence, which there was not a position of its ilk anywhere in Britain. This was the first. Medical jurisprudence essentially was a combination of public health and forensics. So it looked at jurisprudence in the sense of adulterated food, sanitation and things like that, but it also looked at the criminal investigation side of things. And this was a real step forward. This was a notion which was established on the continent in France and Germany, but was very new to Britain. And he really kind of pushed that idea that essentially that medicine was bigger than an individual patient. You know, medicine wasn't just treating a person, it was preventing disease and looking at conditions which created disease, which really expanded the idea of what medicine was. And of course, in the next century, in the 19th century, you get these huge sanitation and public health reforms. But he was definitely a significant influence in that. Although on that note, he sort of went back on his own opinion, because he pushed through the establishment of this position. It wasn't part of the medical faculty, it was part of the legal faculty in the university. And he made sure that his son, Andrew Duncan Jr., was appointed to that role. So he talked for a long time about the evils of nepotism and people giving jobs to their sons, and then he gets the job for his own son. So I guess as he got older, he maybe changed his mind a little bit on that one.
Duncan provided this shift into public health and forensics. Is that something that he learnt from the continent or from his experience in dispensaries or elsewhere?
I don't know for sure whether he learned it from the continent. I would say it's very likely that he did, but I don't know that with any 100% confidence. His version was definitely slightly different to the continental version, which they used the term medical police, and I think it was much more controlled, maybe authoritative. I think it was much more top-down. And I think Andrew Duncan's version, while it involved, you know, the need for legislative changes, was less sort of controlling perhaps than the German version. So probably he was influenced by that, but he definitely altered it for his own version. Definitely in the dispensaries, and this is something that comes through not just with Duncan's dispensary in Edinburgh, but dispensaries across Scotland and England, that a lot of the really big public health reformers are people who are running or working in dispensaries. And the argument is that they saw the poor in their homes, in their natural environments, in a way that obviously there are some physicians who never treat poor people at all. They only treat rich people. So they are particularly removed. But also people who work in infirmaries see people outside of their context. You know, they see people in a sort of sanitized version of their lives. So one of the suggestions is that physicians who work in dispensaries, because they do home visits and because they see people on the day-to-day, they are seeing a different version, and that forms their view of the importance of cleanliness and drainage and all those sorts of things. I think that's probably partially true. I think it's also partially true that the sort of person who wanted to work in a dispensary was maybe someone who already had an interest in the sick, poor and their lives. But definitely Andrew Duncan was particularly interested in that, and I think that did influence his work in jurisprudence. And there are definitely other big examples in Newcastle, in Manchester and Liverpool of people in similar positions really being at the forefront of ideas around contagion and contamination.
So what was the patient's perspective of this dispensary and of being a teaching tool, essentially?
I think it's varied. One advantage from the patient's perspective of dispensaries is if you don't like it, you can just not go back. There are cases in infirmaries and also in hospitals that were based in workhouses of patients running away, but it was a lot more difficult. You know, there was people sneaking out in the night because they didn't like it. So there are certainly cases where patients just don't like the particular type of treatment, and so they just don't go again. There's also plenty of examples of patients arguing back. The history of medicine, as in the sort of books written by historians, you get a feeling that there is this real imbalance of power in this period, and the patient really, especially the poor patient who was, the charitable patient, really had no control over treatment. But that's not really what comes through in Duncan, and they regularly will say, I'm just not doing that. And if he wants them to stay as a patient, which he generally does because he wants to see them over a period of time, both to help them and to study them, he often will change his treatment as to what the patient is willing to accept. So particularly unpopular tended to be electricity and blistering. Those were the two where patients were very unenthusiastic. They quite liked being bled, but they didn't like being blistered. Blistering essentially involves opening or creating a sore on a patient, literally blistering them with heat, and often they would then create it into what was called an issue, which meant it was made into a constant weeping wound. So the idea is you rubbed in mustard or onion and that meant it didn't heal. This is really an archaic hangover from much earlier ideas about the humours, which is the idea that you have to have this balance of different fluids in your body. And so an awful lot of medical treatment in the early modern period is literally about getting stuff out. It's all about whether it's bleeding or blistering or vomiting. It's all about there's something bad in you that you need to get out. And it's starting to disappear by the end of the 18th century, but there's still some slightly strange hangovers, and things like blistering are part of that. And electricity is exactly what you would think it is. It is electricity. It's an incredibly mild shock. It's nothing like the ECT that comes later. It's essentially you hold on to two brass rods, someone kind of turns a wheel, and it creates electricity. The charge is very slight, usually, but Andrew Duncan's patients were not comfortable with it, partially because it was apparently physically painful, but also because there was a fear of this new technology and this new treatment which they'd never seen before. But I would say broadly, I think the fact that the patients had so much freedom, the idea was you turned up every day or every other day to get your medicine and to be examined, and then you went away again. So if you never wanted to go back, you just didn't have to go back. There was a lot less control than there would be in a workhouse or an infirmary.
Is that to do more with a lack of authority on Duncan's part, or did Duncan welcome this shift in the balance of the traditionally paternal relationship between doctor and patient?
He was very keen on listening to patients, which he wasn't entirely unique in that, but I think the infirmaries by this point, a lot of infirmaries, there are a couple of very early infirmaries in London that exist for hundreds of years, but the earliest one in Scotland is the Royal Edinburgh Infirmary from the 1720s. And infirmaries by the end of the 18th century were becoming very large institutions, hundreds of patients, not enough staff, and so the amount of time they were actually able to spend on each patient was quite small. Whereas they just didn't have the time or the ability to sit down and listen to every individual. But Duncan was very focused on every individual patient, what was their story, what was their experience. Again, it's difficult to distinguish what is him being a good physician and a good human being and what is him trying to study and learn from these people in a sort of professional or academic way. This will make a great book someday, That had to be somewhere in his mind. So I think some of it is his approach and his personality, but I think it's also the fact that this is just how dispensaries worked to an extent. You had to be more lenient towards your patient. You don't have them sort of trapped. They have to, there's a choice that they make. So I think in general, dispensaries encourage the listening to patients, the taking into account the patient's needs, because that's just fundamentally how they operated.
You mentioned that dispensaries were a place to experiment and to try new things. So are there any particular innovations or new techniques that came out of dispensaries?
The biggest innovation, really, it's not so much about dispensaries inventing things. I think, to me, it's about dispensaries normalizing things. So it's very rare to find an infirmary or another type of sort of large-scale institution supplying smallpox vaccinations. Dispensaries were generally the first to supply those on a large scale for free. So the Edinburgh Dispensary did that very early in the process after the Edward Jenner's discovery of inoculation. It was within a year they set up their vaccine institute. Same thing happened in Newcastle. The same thing happened to the Kelso Dispensary. There was a void where there was no other organisation that was doing it. Infirmaries weren't, town councils weren't. So they were propagating ideas and normalising ideas that initially people were very suspicious about, and then after a while you go, well, actually enough people are inoculated, this is now just normal. I don't know about inventions as such, specific medical cures or treatments. There was certainly a lot of advances made, but some of the time with these things, it feels a little bit like the great white man theory. And I realise that I'm talking a lot about Andrew Duncan, but, the idea that there's one person who invented something, and often it is very difficult to tell because one person's coming up with a theory, another person slightly advances it, and of course it's this sort of very slow melding process.
So you mentioned that Duncans Dispensary was the first in Scotland. Were there many more that cropped up, and were they based on Duncan's model?
They varied slightly. Sometimes for example, the one in Kelso, which is down near the borders, that was actually set up by a local landed gentry family, and it was quite different. There wasn't the sort of teaching research side of things. It was a much more functional organized, not that Andrew Duncan's dispensary wasn't functional, but it was much more treating patients rather than all the extra kind of research, experimental teaching side of things. So it varied slightly from place to place. Sometimes they are offshoots of infirmaries, sometimes they are in direct competition with infirmaries. So it varies a little from place to place.
You mentioned that there was a distinction between the sort of patient who went to the infirmary and the sort of patient who went to the dispensary. So what sorts of diseases and conditions were treated at the dispensary in comparison to elsewhere?
The big difference really between infirmaries and dispensaries tended to be that infirmaries treated primarily acute conditions. So whether it was somebody needing an operation or somebody with a very kind of advanced case of tuberculosis, for example, it tended to be people in a very acute state. Dispensaries, although they still had some patients like that, tended to be much more chronic. So these are the long-term medical conditions, maybe that they wouldn't have been admitted to an infirmary for, maybe they would have just lived with for an incredibly long time. So it was rheumatism. It was sometimes very advanced states of venereal disease, but often things like mental health related conditions, headaches, an awful lot of people with intestinal worms. It's essentially a huge raft of often debilitating, but the sort of conditions where you would probably still keep working, still keep living with your family, and you would somehow just keep going. And one of the things that stands out is how many different medical conditions one person would have. So someone would go to the dispensary when something got sufficiently bad, so their eyesight got so bad they literally couldn't see. And then Duncan would say, well, they've come in for this, but while they're here, they've also got 2 broken fingers and they've got intestinal worms, and this woman hasn't menstruated for 5 years. So they'd have all these things that they would just survive with. And I think that's what I find really interesting. A lot of the time when people look at the history of medicine, they really focus on the dramatic diseases, the syphilis, the smallpox, these sort of small number of often very quickly fatal, really dramatic diseases. So it's what people die of, but there's also what people live with, that people just kind of come to terms with. And one thing that surprised me was over 50% of the women who were admitted into the dispensary were not menstruating and hadn't menstruated for at least months, if not years, which says an awful lot about, the nutrition and the lives that they were living. So I think this gives a lot more insight maybe into the social side or the human side of people's lives, rather than just when people are on their deathbeds. This is everyday people's lives.
So that tells quite a lot about the attitudes of people towards seeking medical assistance. So was that due to a lack of knowledge, or due to the fact that it was just something that you lived with, or an aversion to some of the treatments that doctors were giving?
It's a combination. I think partially it was quite difficult for a poor person to gain access to a doctor. You really had to be admitted to an infirmary or a dispensary, because generally speaking, the amount that a doctor would charge in his private practice would be just beyond people's means. I guess as well, there isn't such a fine line between what is professional and unprofessional medicine. Because of course we know now, you are a qualified doctor or you're not. Obviously it wasn't that simple then. So people would think just as much perhaps of a local healer or, a local sort of itinerant seller of, medicines as they would of Andrew Duncan or someone similar. It was much more grey area. And one of the things Andrew Duncan recorded about his patients was if they had tried to undertake any other treatment, non-professional or non-physicianly treatments, he recorded those. So there are quite a few examples of his neighbour told him to rub butter on his head for this wound. And then Andrew Duncan, slightly sort of scathingly says, maybe if you have an open wound, rubbing butter into it isn't the greatest idea. So there are still hangovers of these kind of folk medicine, or really very much on the cusp of what we would actually think of as medicine, because it is almost this sort of mystical end of medical practice. So they were sometimes trying these things, but largely it was restricted access through lack of wealth. I mean, these weren't just working class people, these were often the poorest of the poor. So they just didn't have that many resources open to them.
How did Duncan balance this more institutional approach to medicine in comparison to domestic medicine and apothecaries and stuff like that?
He tried to be quite open-minded about it. If he thought the treatment was clearly unhelpful, there was one where a cure for the headache was pulling out basically all your hair off your head. And so in cases like that, he was very clear that this was not helpful. But there are a few other cases where there were a couple of women based in Edinburgh. There's one woman who specifically had this renowned treatment for worms, intestinal worms. And he described how he'd studied the data, he'd seen some of her patients, and he felt that potentially her treatment was a good one. So he would refer his patients to her at times because he felt her treatment was good. I'm not sure he always managed to be completely balanced, because I think sometimes it clearly just made him very irate when people were doing really what he saw as ridiculous things. But he did try and look at the evidence and to see if there was any grounding in reality. Because of course, even now there are some of these treatments which are acknowledged to work in a modern sense. And even if they don't work in a traditional 21st century medicine sense, they may have acted as a placebo. They may have helped people to feel better. So, it was complicated. It was a dance he was trying to sort of balance between the two sides of things. But he was certainly conscious that it wasn't only what the professors at the university said that was necessarily helpful.
With the patients who went to Duncans Dispensary, was there a certain locality to it, or did people come from far and wide to get treatment?
He doesn't always record exactly geographically where they come from, so it's a little bit hard to say. He talks quite often of people having come in from the country. Particularly comes up in the context of the electricity, because in order to be electrified, you had to physically come to his building. So obviously if somebody lived far away and it was medicines, it was fine. You could just give them 3 weeks worth. But he mentions quite a few times that people live too far away and cannot make the walk. So I would certainly say it was beyond just the old town of Edinburgh, but exactly how far, I don't know. Obviously it was harder with a dispensary than it was with an infirmary because, again, the fact they didn't have beds. So the infirmary could take somebody from Shetland or any kind of remote part of Scotland, and that was fine. In the dispensary, if they came there, they'd need to find somewhere to stay in town. But certainly they weren't immediately, in a very small condensed area. There were certainly people who were passing through as well. There's quite a few mentions of Highlanders who've gone down to England for harvest work. And they're coming back, and it was the most common condition was malaria. It was ague, or often considered now to be malaria. But they were literally walking back from England up to the Highlands and would essentially stop in at the dispensary to get their treatment on their way home. So if you were passing through, as was increasingly common when people were looking for work, the dispensary was sort of known or renowned enough that people from outside the city would know about it and would know to go there.
So there wasn't really a typical type of patient who went to the dispensary. There was such a varied number of people.
Yes, there was. And I guess, again, this is to go back to the comparison with infirmaries. I'd say dispensaries have a relatively even spread in terms of gender and in terms of age. Infirmaries generally do not. Infirmaries are usually weighed in favour of men, and particularly working age men. And a big part of the reason for that is most infirmaries in Britain at this time, you had to get a recommendation for access. So basically the funding for infirmaries came from philanthropy, came from major donors. And if you as a patient wanted to be admitted, you had to get Lord whoever to kind of write you a recommendation. And I think that's in large part what skewed it. So only fit and healthy young men could get these, and so they were predominantly admitted. So dispensaries were quite even. There wasn't really a bias in favour of any particular group, which was really good for women and young people and old people, because it was quite hard for them to get a place in an infirmary.
How would you say that Duncan's dispensary, or Duncan himself, changed the landscape of medicine, both in Edinburgh and further afield?
Part of what Duncan did in other dispensaries as well, but I think particularly Duncan, is that this is in effect a fight back against this idea of the deserving and undeserving poor. As infirmaries grow and as workhouses grow as well, there's this real move towards only providing treatment for a specific group of people. It has been decided that they are essentially good people. And what Duncan's dispensary does is it treats everybody. It doesn't turn people away because they are an unmarried woman, or because they have venereal disease, or because they drink too much, or anything like that. They treat everybody, and that is quite unusual for a time when the whole culture of charity and society is shifting. So I think that's really important. I think it's not really about, the great invention or whatever. It's about the whole mindset of how you approach your patients and how you treat your patients. And by teaching, what he did was he taught the next generation of physicians who went on to work in dispensaries all over England and Scotland. So he's kind of pushing this idea of medicine being available to all, treatment being available to all, us not drawing any line based on any criteria. And that's a really important move, I think.
If you were to summarise a lesson for people to take away from this for the modern age, would that be it, not drawing a line?
Absolutely. I think not drawing a line between your patients and listening to your patients, because that was certainly something which the enormous number of volumes of case notes shows just how much Andrew Duncan listened and recorded of how his patients felt.
Thank you very much for coming to chat to me today. It's been fascinating.
Thank you for having me. It's been a really interesting discussion.